Welcome back to Ethics. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about the second half of Book One of Plato's Republic. And this kind of division in Plato's Republic in the first book is marked by the discussion of a particular character named Thrasymachus. Now, as Plato or Socrates is discussing what is justice, Thrasymachus jumps on the scene and he presents a substantial challenge to Socrates, and it's a kind of relativistic challenge. And whereas Socrates and his interlocutors are looking for some kind of universal and absolute sense of right and wrong, a Socratic definition of what really is justice, Thrasymachus thinks, I know what justice is. And he says that justice is the advantage of the stronger, right? And what this means is that justice is really the rules that people in power make, right? And those are all based on the self-interest of the people in power. And the idea is that politicians or dictators or rulers, kings, queens, whatever, make laws based on what will serve their own needs, keep them in power, make them more wealthy, whatever, right? And then we as the masses follow those laws and call following those laws justice, right? Insofar as we adhere to kind of the self-interest of the people in power, then we are doing what is just. And so I say that this is a relativistic position. And so we should say something about what moral relativism is and what moral objectivism is, okay? So Plato is thought to be a moral objectivist, right? And this is the idea that moral principles, our sense of right and wrong, has to do with principles that are absolute, right, and universal in scope, right? They're not dependent upon our whims or beliefs, right? There are absolute sense of, certain things are just right and certain things are just wrong. And so that's the idea of what moral objectivism is, right? So something like you might say murder is just wrong, right? It's always wrong. It's always bad, right? And that's just universal and absolute. Now, moral relativism is the idea that there are no universal or absolute ethical principles. There are just senses of right and wrong that really cohere with certain belief systems, right? And there are different kinds of or scopes of belief system, right? So you can have your personal belief system and think that right or wrong just has to do with what either agrees with or disagrees with your personal belief system. And then you can also have something like cultural relativism, where, what's right or wrong just has to do with what is, allowed in your culture, right? But the idea of moral relativism is that there's nothing kind of beyond that, right? There's nothing beyond your cultural norms to adhere to when it comes to morality. We might view our cultural norms as the norms that everyone should have, but the idea is that we're really not justified in thinking that way. And that's what relativism is. And so when Thrasymachus says justice is the advantage of the stronger, implicitly what he's saying is that there's no sense of right or wrong beyond the laws of any particular city or state or country or whatever, right? The slogan I use to describe this is might is right, right? What constitutes our sense of what is just or what is right is really the things that people in power say is right, right? Basically, the laws are just extensions of the self-interest of those in power, and that's it, right? People come to power and they determine certain rules or laws, and then that makes a sense of right or wrong, right? And so Um, Notice that this actually corresponds to a lot of, even though we're thinking something along the lines of like what we would consider to be a corrupt ruler who acts out of self-interest. Um, this actually gives a lot of justification for a lot of common principles, ethical principles. So, for example, stealing, right? Why would people in power establish a law like you can't steal? Well, because they usually have the most stuff, right? And so they want a law that makes sure that they keep their stuff, and that other people are not taking it, and that they have a means to punish them that's considered to be right. But also, it creates a certain amount of order amongst the masses, right? And that's another thing that for a lot of the laws that we, or a sense of principles, ethical principles, that creates a lot of harmony out in the world, right? And that makes it kind of easier for people in power to exploit people, right, in different ways. So Thrasymachus is making kind of a relativistic claim. It's also a claim that one might say is a kind of version of what's called ethical egoism. And this is the idea that ethical principles are ultimately based on self-interest, right? And so Thrasymachus is giving a version of this. Now, Socrates levels a bunch of, or at least three main objections to this view. And the first one has to do with what is a ruler, right? So what the people who are the stronger, according to Thrasymachus, are the rulers, right? People who have political power, people who have power in society. It's not just people who are strong, right? It's not the person who can bench press the most or something like this. And so Socrates kind of presses him on this. Well, what do you mean by a ruler, right? Like lots of people act out of self-interest all the time. That doesn't seem to be the defining feature of a ruler, right? And he says, what a ruler does is act out of the interest of their subjects, right? So the people that they rule over. That's the whole point of being a ruler or like a politician or a leader, right? They're supposed to tend to the needs of the people that they lead or rule over and kind of represent and meet those needs, right? That's what it is to do that skill or that craft. And that's, how we define a ruler. Now, that doesn't mean that all rulers act like this. There are cases in which a ruler, fails to be a good ruler, right? And they act out of self-interest, or they don't really meet the needs of people that they're ruling over. But that just means that they're failing to do their job in the right sort of way. And why is this significant? Well, Thrasymachus thinks that rulers essentially act out of self-interest. And if that's the case, then it's hard to see why Thrasymachus is not just giving us a picture of a bad ruler, right? Or someone who's a corrupt ruler, right? And if that's the case, what you can notice here is that being a corrupt ruler or being a corrupt politician or something like this is always understood as failing to do what you're supposed to be doing as a politician or a ruler or whatever, right? So, for example, if you were open about acting out of self-interest, if you told everyone, when you're running your campaign, what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise taxes on everyone. I'm going to take all that money and I'm going to put it in my pocket. I'm going to buy an island and I'm going to leave, right? No one's going to vote for you, right? Your authority at your position will kind of dwindle away, right? You'll lose it if you're too openly corrupt, or if it's too obvious that you're acting out of self-interest. And the reason why this is because acting out of self-interest, it seems, cannot be the rule. It can only be the exception to the rule, right? You always have to have a certain facade that you're acting out of the interest of other people in order to kind of have that authoritative role, right? So that's one kind of hit against Thrasymachus's view. But Thrasymachus kind of comes back and says that he thinks that Socrates is a fool for thinking this way, and that ultimately people are always out to just make money or to kind of get themselves further along, right? They're always looking out for their own self-interest. And so, and then the issue of some different crafts kind of comes into play. I think Thrasymachus mentions sheep herders and stuff, but Socrates considers a bunch of different crafts. And he says, what does a doctor do? Well, they act out of self-interest or the interest of the patient. Well, they act out of the interest of the patient, right? And notice again, right? If a doctor only acts out of self-interest, it seems weird to say that they're really a doctor, right? So if you can't really act out of interest of your patient, then you're just a person who's got a lab coat that's selfish, right? I mean, and if you think of other crafts, what does house framer do? They focus on framing houses, right? And I like to use the example, well, what does a shoemaker do, right? And for Socrates, he thinks a shoemaker should make shoes, right? Thrasymachus thinks a shoemaker makes money, right? And he thinks that that's what a shoemaker really ought to do, is focus on making money out of that craft. What Socrates says is, well, look, if your focus is on making money, you're going to make bad shoes, right? You're going to use inferior materials because it's cheaper. You're going to spend less time on the shoes. You're not going to really tend to your craft or learn how to do it well because you'll be focused always on kind of that profit. And so if you focus on making money, you'll make bad shoes. However, if you reverse the order of operations and you focus on making good shoes, you're likely to make money, right? So if you put the goal of making money in front of the craft suffers. But if you put the craft in front of the kind of end result of making money, then it doesn't take away from your making money, right? You still will likely earn a lot of money, right? So this is again like this idea of the kind of logical priority of putting a craft first before self-interest. That self-interest always has to come second to these kinds of things, whether that craft is being a ruler or making shoes or medicine or whatever. Thrasymachus again is not really happy with this. And he thinks that, people are still ultimately, the way he puts it is that people are out to outdo others. And Socrates considers this example as well. And here he says that, well, he gives the example of what's known as honor among thieves, right? And the idea is that, sure, like by myself, I can steal a little bit of money. Maybe I can hold up a liquor store or something like this. But if I want to make a big score, I have to bring in other people, right? And if I'm going to bring in other people, then our heist is not going to go very far unless we have a certain amount of trust and honor amongst all the people that are involved in the heist. Let's say we're planning a big bank heist or something like this. And this is the idea that, everyone in that group has to exhibit a certain amount of cooperation and what you might call justice, right? There has to be a certain sense of honesty, trustworthiness, cooperation in order for us to do something that is ultimately bad, right? And really, the more disciplined you are as an individual, the better you're going to be at doing bad things, right? And so again, this is another example where Socrates thinks, look, being just doing things kind of well or some sense of good, right, always has to precede doing something bad, right? Being bad can't be the rule. That's the idea, right? It always has to be the exception to the rule. And what Thrasymachus is proposing is that being bad, right, which he thinks is just for him, being bad is the right thing to do. In some sense, it can't be the rule, right? And so that's the line that Socrates takes here. So that's it for now. And we will talk more about this and relativism as the weeks come. Okay.